Today evening, our guest is Rohit Malekar, and he is a product leader at the Big Four Consulting Group. In today's interaction, we look forward to talking with Rohit on different topics, including tech, consulting, building products, culture, why culture matters for your scale, growth, and much more. So let's get this started. I'll do a short introduction for Rohit and followed by who we are and what we do at First Principles. So Rohit started his career with Tech Mahindra and moved to US to pursue his master's from Indiana University, later working at HP and then at a Big Four consulting group. He spent around half a decade in US prior to returning to India. He holds more than 15 years of experience, 17.6 to be precise, out of which 12 years he has spent leading product and building culture and leading that practice at the Big Four consulting groups. He loves talking about DAO, aka DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and strongly believes that communities hold a lot of potential where the decisions are decentralized, and all this built on digital ecosystem/platform using blockchain as a technology. So we are soon going to talk about the power of collectivity here. Rohit hails from Kolhapur, Maharashtra, and is currently based in Bangalore, Karnataka. Where not working, he loves writing poems and learning golf. I'd be very happy to learn a few lessons from you and Amit when I visit Bangalore. And for our first-time listeners, I'll do a real quick introduction about who we are and what we do at First Principles. We build, we acquire, we scale vertical leading SaaS companies making 1 to 5 million in ARR. We use our experience, playbook, network, and capital to take your SaaS to the next level. So without further ado, welcome Rohit. Super excited about this chat, and we at First Principles are happy to have you as our guest today.
Thanks, Nav. Thanks for that comprehensive and very generous introduction. Looking forward to this conversation as well.
Sure. So Rohit, I was going through your LinkedIn profile and I saw you started career with TechM. And this is the 2003 early. We see Sifi everywhere as internet connection, people using Yahoo as the AOL as the chat messenger. Reliance was bringing the LG era to India. Everyone wanted to become Mac, going into electrical. And I see you selecting the technology/consulting as your career. I individually am always curious about why people select their career. So I'd be interested to know about why technology, because career plays a very huge role in our life. Would love to understand what decision led to get into technology and then especially in the consulting group.
Sure, yeah, it definitely sounds a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Yeah, I think when I was doing my higher schooling, which is the 12th standard equivalent in the Maharashtra state of education, I did want to do mechanical as well. I think I was attracted to graphic design a lot in context of mechanical engineering and so on. But I think somewhere throughout that experience, I was attracted to the aspect of use of computing and programming as a whole. I have to be candid, I did not know a whole lot when I picked the stream for computer engineering. I think in hindsight it worked out well, but it's as good as it gets, as people say. I did not think it thoroughly through, but I did definitely enjoy it. So I don't regret making the choice, but I'm going to disappoint you with my answer. There's not a lot of thought work behind there, besides the fact that computing as a field was expanding. The myth of Y2K was almost broken. The fact that nothing's going to melt down was pretty evident. So that helped me pick the stream.
Nice, and starting as a team lead, and I'm assuming this is Satyam before the TechM actually acquired.
Right, that's right. Yeah, it was Tech Mahindra in fact, and what was known as the Mahindra British Telecom. So I came from that part of the what we now know as the Satyam entity.
Nice. So I also see that you spent over a decade at the Big Four consulting group. So I would love to understand your role, the key functions you lead and operate in.
Yeah, sure. I think I feel very fortunate to be playing at this intersection where I'm able to do a lot of what we would typically classify as product management, going everything from trying to solve, is this the problem worth solving, all the way to building something that's worth investing, but doing it in context of a specific industry for a specific client. So for what it's worth, it brings in joys of both worlds, and it brings in troubles of both worlds as well in context of consulting and product management. So I spend about half of my time with my clients who are in a variety of stages in their own digital transformation journey, helping them build experiences that are catered either to their employees or their customers or business partners. And then I spend the other half of the time building the practice itself, which is essentially how do we get better as consultants doing product management, which means trying to solve two questions essentially. Are we solving the right problem for the client, and then are we doing it the
Right.
right way?
No, that's interesting because at First Principles product team, we focus on adding value. And we often ask ourselves this question: are we adding the right value at the right stage? And are the clients happy about it? Our goal at FP, product team, is that to deliver the best SaaS products and under budget and within the time. So we often kind of experiment. So I think the one new experiment that we are doing right now these days is using no code / low code. So literally 20 years ago, the business analysis phase itself used to take maybe 3 to 4 months, going through from documentation, FRDs, SRS, PRDs. And right now today, we can just plug and play. The code remains the same. It's just pretty much the logic layer or the business layer kind of change. Interesting. So I'm sure you must be having some few memories moving from Maharashtra to Indiana University for your MS, and then joining the Big Four. So we would love to understand some of your maybe new realizations when you moved to US. So yeah.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, what was the biggest revelation, and something that worked in my favor, was just the fact that exposing yourself to a culture that's different from what you grew up with just organically expands your horizon and opens you up for bigger possibilities, which is hard to do when you don't move out of your comfort zone.
Right.
It's not impossible, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
harder to do when you are surrounded by people who think like you. Then the realm of possibilities is lesser, and so that wasn't my reason necessarily to go for my master's. I think point in time I wanted to know more about the field, and I wanted to study more, get
Uh-huh.
more avenues from a career standpoint. But I think in hindsight, just being exposed to way of thinking that's different from what you grew up with, I think was the biggest revelation, and it just keeps paying dividends, through the rest of the career. Then, so if your life situation can allow it, I'd definitely encourage anybody to sort of experience at least a few months or a few years in a culture different than yours.
No, I totally agree. And Amit and I often have this interaction. I keep on telling Amit that I want to complete my MS. So yeah, let's see. Um, sure. So I think the interesting fact, Rohit, that Big Four, you spent more than a decade. Would love to understand, what are of a few things that you often do on your kind of daily role. Maybe how does your day looks like, and then we'll move to some some questions from there.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds good. So I think over time, one of the lessons I learned the hard way getting into consulting, and I think this was definitely true outside of Big Four as well, is the first few months in the firm, I had the attitude of waiting for direction. And I learned it the hard way that literally there are very few watertight compartments. The culture is pretty much permissionless, and if you see a problem you can fix, you should just go ahead and fix it. That's not something that came
Uh-huh.
organically to me. So I think that was one of the lessons learned, which shapes my day-to-day very much at this stage in the career. So as an example, right, because of the size and the scale, not a lot of changes are possible overnight, both
Right.
internally at the size we are, as well as with some of our clients, most of which happen to be, within the Fortune 500 bucket. So then the
Right.
question is, most of my daily work is what are the steps 1 to 10 we need to take so that steps 11 to 15 can be accelerated, so that steps 16 to 20 can happen at scale and deliver impact. So that wasn't something that came intuitively to me. So both for internal practice challenges as well as some of the client problems that we have, we all of us love strategic thinking
Right.
and painting the blue sky and figuring out the end state. But a significant part of my job is also figuring then steps 1 to 20 to get there. So at a very high level, that's most of my day, and all the risk management that comes with that.
So basically, like, making sure that the teams are set for success from, like, scaling from 10 to 20, like, that scale. And I think one of the key success factor is culture, which we will be surely be talking in some time, because I think as you scale, the culture, the DNA becomes very important for you to succeed, and not just from 10 to 20, but also, like, from 20 to 50. And if your base is, like, is built strongly, then there are high chances that you will be succeeding.
True.
Awesome, awesome. So I was going through, like, your Twitter profile. As always, I love your poetry, and also kind of, like, the tweets, the insights that you share about blockchain, DAOs, and DeFi. So my question, right? So in 70s and 80s, we discovered the central databases. So we were, like, struggling with duplicate entries, redundant, and how to operate and save databases, or, like, data rooms. We moved from on-premise data rooms to more of a connected central database, accessible for everyone, like, connected with internet. Fast forward 20 years, we are talking about blockchain storing the duplicate keys and, like, data on every node. So why blockchain, like, and why decentralized applications to slash, like, DeFi, which is like decentralized finance, and how it works?
Yeah, I think that's a fairly loaded question, and by no means I'm a tech architect, so I'm not going to pretend to be one. But this is my understanding. I think, as with any technology, we should look at blockchain in context of a use case, as you pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
DeFi is one of them, and blockchain won't be solving world hunger. So I don't see a future where every other tech application is basically built off of blockchain. I see it as a Ferrari of automobiles, and
Right.
and as much as we all want one, we all don't need one. So that's how I look at blockchain as a whole. I think fundamentally the way I like a definition of how it's going to disrupt the lives we live a few years down the line is that, and I'm going to steal this line from a book called Green Pilled,
Mm-hmm.
where it says the technology essentially allows you to convert your values into programmable money. And so let me maybe double click, on that a little bit. So whatever your community's shared values are, um, you can essentially capture that value into a token, which makes it possible to create an economy around your community using that token, which essentially represents the value that you cherish. Now that value will change based on different communities and what you really hold dear to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But having that power to essentially design a microeconomy, and be able to use it to collaborate with each other, for me is the biggest differentiator that the blockchain is going to provide. That may manifest in some cases using decentralized finance, where the token or the money essentially captures a certain aspect of your financial workflow. It could manifest on the other end of the spectrum. If I take an example of a Gitcoin, which is essentially a platform to fund open source software in Web3, and the value there is collaboration. And so the token, the more community believes in that as a value to cherish and sustain, the higher the value of that token is going to be. And so essentially all the historical and traditional barriers to collaboration that were presented because we were using fiat as a currency are now in theory replaceable, because you now have a token that represents the value you cherish, and now you can collaborate and create your own communities. So that's the theory. I think in practice, we all know there are a lot of challenges when
Right.
any number of people come together, right from culture to how to work together to how to grow together, are very intricate questions, and there can be a lot of opinions on how to make it happen. So the last thing I'll say on this is, the technology alone is not going to cut it. I think we need a variety of diverse thoughts across how humans work with each other, behavioral scientists, psychologists, non-technologists, designers. I think everybody needs to come together and then figure out
Yeah.
what role this technology needs to play in our lives.
No, it's in and like good that you mentioned about communities and individually. I'm a fan of collective accountability. Like if we see, and there are like a lot of use cases that like we can implement. Maybe a government, maybe like NGO, and helping like society to like grow using technology. Is I think the best that can happen, or like the best use of the technology. So I'm just curious, and like in a DAO, which is like decentralized autonomous organization, how do you take decisions in this setup? Like who leads the decision? Because it's everyone, like community coming together, people having like different thoughts, everyone coming from like different cultures. So how do you like really drive like decisions and towards the end, like meeting that collective accountability kind of like goal?
Right. I think it's a very interesting space, and the right answers are being tried and tested as we speak. So there are no best practices as yet. I think some of the patterns that have helped is the fact that if the community has come together for a cause which is beyond the economics, which is beyond the financial gain, those communities tend to do well in setting up processes that work for them in terms of how do you resolve decisions, and in case of a conflict, how do you arbitrate that conflict. So it all goes back to the field of organization design at the end of the day. And there is an entire spectrum where, at its highest level, the two layers that a decentralized autonomous organization is made up of consists of: one, the social layer, right? The people who come together and create a certain kind of rule set on how do we work with each other. So that's your social layer. And then there is the autonomous layer, which is to say, hey, which of these rules can be codified as quote unquote smart contracts that can execute on their own
Ah,
based on certain set of triggers. So now there is a balance. There is a social layer,
yes.
and then there is an autonomous layer. Now, based on what is the relative distribution of how you have designed your DAO, there is, you can imagine, a range of possibilities here. And there is no right or wrong answer. I think I think in the near future, there's going to be a role for a governance designer, if that
Yes.
is a word. And essentially, what that person's job is going to be is based on the context of the community, their culture, and the problem they're trying to solve. What is the best organization structure and governance for making the DAO to be successful? So the short answer to your question is, there are DAOs who have been completely successful by having everything decentralized, where all and every single decision happens on a vote. And there are communities where the voting happens only for very few critical decisions, and a central core group of coordinators run everything. So as I said, there's no right answer, but I hope it shows up the spectrum of
Yes.
possibilities.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, beautiful. And like some 10 years ago, I was a big fan of building something for transparent, like, governance. So I was thinking as, like, building, let's say we have, like, just a software that lets people to add, like, their problems. Like, imagine a government Jira, like, platform where people would
True.
add, like, their problems. Oh, hey, we have like issues with, like, let's say electricity, maybe, like, power supply, water supply, and then individuals from government agency would, like, pick up and provide, like, much more like, information about what's happening with their like, tickets and so on. But like breaking that further down into like small communities, I think it's a very good, like, interesting idea. And
Right.
I really like how it is, like, being structured, and I see that how it goes, like, back to the blockchain where you mentioned about the smart contracts. So I think for real estate, blockchain is a very good, like, use case, because often, like, we see that there have been issues such as like land fraud and, like, title, like, being misplaced or, like, being taken away by someone else. But having that keys with through within that network helps, because you really cannot, like, alter with like, the nodes and the smart contracts and, like, the chain. Also, like, here in DAO, having that accountability, like, once the decision is being made, you cannot, like, change, and there's, like, transparency about how that decision was, like, taken. So yeah, interesting.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah, I think one thing I'll say, the two interesting examples that you brought, one was in context of just the government operations and being able to do it transparently, and the other was land records. I think one of the least discussed topics in this field, aside from all the euphoria and hype about how blockchain is going to solve world hunger, is the fact that no one's addressing the politics that is going to be involved in making this technology mainstream. At the end of the day, the biggest challenge is not going to be the social aspect of the community. It is not going to be the engineering of the autonomous layer. They are problems and they will get solved. The biggest problem in this is what we are trying to decentralize. Essentially, we are trying to decentralize power.
power,
And
right?
what that means is the communities will have to have a dialogue with centers of power today, whether it's media, whether it's music industry, whether it's government, whatever space you're trying to disrupt. Those who are controlling the power need to be willing to be open and share and decentralize. Only then all of this tech and community will fit in
Agree.
the social context. I just feel this is one of the least discussed, concepts and all the hype and euphoria behind the tech.
No, and building communities is becoming critical as well. So if you really see, like, how Stripe grew their like, SaaS product, they focused on building communities, and they built something for very specific to, like, engineers, to developers. They were their first statement was like, easy to integrate payment solutions for engineers, and not for, like, clients, not for, like, their end users, but highly focused on engineers. And then they heavily invested into, like, building communities, the dev conferences and so on. So I think communities itself, irrespective, like, falling within the DAO, or, like, as community as simple as, like, having a group of engineers, is going to play a very critical role. So, like, taking a look at, like, from 2016 to 20, like, pre-COVID era, it was like more of a sharing economy. We saw Uber, we saw Airbnb, RV Share, CrowdMed, like, product coming in. And then came, like, the cloud, people moving, like, from on premises to everything moving to cloud. What is the next boom that, like, you see in the software field or the software industry?
I I'm not certain if this is going to be a boom or not, but one wishful thought I have, which I hope turns true, is the concept of platform cooperatives. So continuing the theme on community, I'm hoping that the barriers to starting up and the barriers to technology are lowering to the extent that communities can come together to create a platform and co-own the company together. So as an example, there is a ride hailing company in New York which is co-owned by the driver. It's called Drivers Co-op. So if it can happen in New York, I mean, it could happen in theory pretty much every big city where you don't have to give the intermediaries the most share of your value. The creators of the value in this case, right? The cab drivers could keep most
Hmm.
of it.
Yeah.
I think traditionally the two biggest challenges in context of building software has been access to capital, and then secondly, just the barrier to use and adopt technology. And I think with every passing year, both of these barriers are lowering with access to alternative capital outside of venture itself.
Yeah.
And, with low code and no code, a lot of the technology hopefully becomes easier to adopt. So I'm hoping that the confluence of these two empowers more communities to create platform cooperatives. So the softwares that we use in the future may not necessarily be by a company that's listed in a share market. It would be owned by the people who create the value.
Interesting, interesting. So, do you see similarities between the way we have cooperative societies in Maharashtra, running on similar principles, but maybe minus the technology?
Yes, similar. I think if we go back to the history of cooperatives, like the Rochdale principles, the seven principles of cooperatives were written in 1844. So I don't think we're talking anything groundbreaking here. I think to your point, adopting those principles and using tech as an enabler to get communities together is hopefully the future. But at the same time, as we discussed, culture and getting community together is easier said than done. It's so that's going to be the biggest challenge. I think the tech and finance hopefully are no longer the biggest challenges.
Agree, agree. I'll agree on that. And even if we look at the current scenario with the cooperative societies, culture and bringing people together or keeping them together as being a challenge. So a lot of sugar factories and everything were formed, but keeping them together was not possible. Privatization kicked in, and cooperatives suffered.
Right, right.
Um, Cool, cool. So now that we are talking about adoption, the next question that I have from Narendran is, how do you decide to go with a self-service portal versus enterprise route for your software or for your SaaS product? So to elaborate more on this, so often you see there are softwares which can be self-service, meaning that you can go on their website, you can sign up, and then your the system is all set up on the cloud. And some of the enterprise, for example, Salesforce, they have enterprise route where you contact the AE, then they set up engagement manager, maybe implementation manager, and then things flow in. How do you decide whether to go with self-service portal or enterprise route, and is there any framework that we can choose from?
Got it. I think I'm going to be the last person who knows a lot of frameworks. I tend to just use horses for the courses, so I'll create a framework on the fly.
Sure.
So maybe let's start with the end in the mind, right? Whether it's self-service or enterprise, at the end of the day, we want to create an experience that makes it easy for the user to perform a certain action in the day of the life. So whether it's ease of doing business or some other metric that we want to track. And to enable that, to take one step prior to that, the way any software enables that is either giving a lot of these features out of the box, so you don't have to do a lot after you buy it, or you make it highly configurable, so you could make it really applicable across a variety of sectors and industries. And during your software design, that's always a healthy balance, right? Like how much do you want the user to make it easy to use out of the box versus how versatile and diverse is your client base, that you need to factor X number of scenarios, so you would rather make it configurable. I think then the first thing that I think of is typically the experiences that tend to be a lot more involved, where you need to configure a certain set of options to give the end user the best experience. They tend to go towards the enterprise route, where you do need to work through a relationship, explain what your context and problem is. So then something like a Salesforce or a NetSuite or a similar platform can be best configured to your use. The power there is its configurability, means you can really adapt it across a variety of industries. The drawback is that initial setup, that you do need to spend time and energy before you could get your day one ROI. On the flip side, like if your use case is such that there is not as much variability in terms of what the user needs to do to start using it and get running with it, I tend to see that most software will then form into the self-service portal, where if you've paid the subscription, you're good to go. You don't even need like a help menu to go run with it. So that could be one approach to sort of break that dilemma or that decision.
And I love the framework that you just created on the fly. So the key takeaways you talked about, like the ease of doing business, which is very important. The second is like the configurability, so how you can easily configure a software. And the third thing I would say is like the context and the relationship building. Often like for larger like maybe like large ACVs and large contracts, it makes sense to kind of like go through a route where you are able to kind of understand their requirements, maybe like understand their business problem, and then see how your software can be configured in a way that the clients like get the highest ROI. Perfect. Narendran, do you have any more like question or a follow-up question on this one?
No, Nav, I think it was pretty much clear from what Rohit had answered in that. Yeah.
Awesome. So moving to the next question, and this is the big topic, Rohit, culture, right? So question from Nandini, basis on the ongoing scenario and evolving situations, what are the important traits of culture that you suggest needed in a company and amongst the team?
Yeah, I think it's probably another half day session. It's one of my favorite topics. But if I have to summarize it, I think this was also true to my own lived experience, is that if you can create an environment where no matter who you are and where you are from, if you can find belonging in the team, everything else is a byproduct. So your specific values that you write or aspects of culture may be different, but if the outcome is that no matter who you are as an individual, if you're able to find belonging in that space, in that company, in that team, then everything else falls in place. So the most important trait of culture would be that how do you create belonging for a variety of people who may think differently, who may problem solve differently. Like even in our field, right, designers
Right.
tend to think differently than engineers, and even within
True.
engineering there's just a wide variety of diversity beyond just the basic attributes of gender and geography and others. There's just sheer diversity of even how people
Yep.
think. So I tend to overdrive on belonging, and if people find belonging, then what happens is they are their true selves inside and outside of the workplace, and when you're your true self, that's when your best work happens. So that's the dotted line I like to connect between belonging to being authentic to producing your best work.
So basically, kind of like having that feeling that this is my team, this is my like tribe, this is where I belong, and often like we see the definition of culture as like fancy offices, like fancy chairs, coffee machines, and so on. That's not culture. That's maybe ambience. But what culture like is literally like what you said, like the people feeling that, oh hey, like this is my team, this is where I belong, this is
Right.
where I feel comfortable, like being in my best version. Awesome. So
Yeah.
again, like my follow-up question to this, Rohit, how do you build that like strong and vibrant culture, and what role does the leadership play in this entire like transition?
I think the way I'd like to say it is getting out of the way. So, so let me start from the beginning, right? I think you have to start culture building right at the point where you do your hiring decisions. Um, is being very meticulous and intentional in ensuring that you're not hiring people who think exactly like you do is important. I think
Yes.
that's the starting point. Everything else tends to be a compounding effect from that decision, which is where I said it jokingly, but which is where you need to get out of the way once you've found that right team. So that's one thing from a hiring standpoint. The other thing, I think all of us, and I found this from being a parent. The best way you can teach something to your kids is not by telling, but by doing, and they learn immensely just by observing people around them. And I think there is that aspect of human nature never changes, no matter how old you grow up. So similarly, in an office setup, right, you could print your values and post it on the wall or put it on the mug, and you have fancy deck on your culture. But at the end of the day, what choices and actions and behaviors the leaders are doing is what the rest of the team will organically pick up. So the best way to build that culture is essentially be that culture, in day-to-day actions, which build up to habits and behaviors.
Right, right. So lead by example, basically, like, when you say that your culture is, oh, hey, we don't kind of like, do the blame game. So the leadership should be in a like, having that lead by example kind of thing where they don't like, put blames. It's like, let's accept, move on, understand what's the problem statement was, maybe document it, and then find like, solutions. So yeah, and hire experts, right? So like someone who can add more value. And this is something that I also like share with my team, is that find someone who is like more smarter than you, and like someone who can add like more value. Nice.
Yeah, and one of the best ways to see that perspective is during conflict resolution. When everything's going nice and well, it's easier to stick to the values that you profess. It's when you tend to resolve conflicts is when a lot of the culture is tested. So conflict resolution, I think, it's a good thing to have, because that's what will build your culture.
True, true, true. And one more thing that you mentioned, Rohit, was on like, the hiring. So right now, the Indian hiring scenario is pretty hot. Like, people giving BMWs to offering like, a lot of like hike. So my question is around like, do you think that we should have a neck to neck hiring strategy or always hire for bench?
I don't know the right answer. I can share what we have done. I think we have toggled between the two based on the economic outlook. So as an example, when we know that as a business we are going to do well, we tend to increase our bench strength, and the reason is that we want to use that buffer to then invest into things that our clients are not asking us to do, because that's your window. I will roughly say that that's your research and development, that's your R&D budget, to essentially use that slack in your team to figure out what should we be building now that's going to be relevant 6 to 8 months down the line. Versus if you're in an economy which is really hard on all businesses, then I would lean towards more neck to neck, which is
Got it.
essentially also to say that, hey, let's not be in a position where we have to let people go. We would
Right.
rather not hire than have to take a tougher decision. So net, I think you might classify this as being financially conservative as a strategy,
Right.
but we see ourselves toggling between the two based on how the overall industry is doing.
Got it. Got it. Uh, and I think like the follow up, the connecting question to this is from Pratik. So hiring is one thing from a scale perspective, but from like let's say from a product perspective, do you build for like build for so there's two thought process. One is like build for MVP, and the other is like build for MVP but keeping the scale, or like considering the future scale. So what would you suggest, like, based on your experience? Is it like focus on one milestone, go build the MVP, like, just try the markets, see if it is like, it's able to run, and then consider like, building for scale? Or is it like build for MVP, but considering like scale. So a mix of like a startup code and an industrial code.
Got it. I'll have to confess, my answer is going to be half baked because there's only one product I've worked in a startup setup, and all of my other product experience has been in a consulting setup for clients. So this question, morphs differently based on what product we're talking about. But based on what the limited experience I've seen, if you're building for B2B, it is incredibly harder to get a right vision for your future scale. So you may have a picture on your drawing board to say that, hey, 2 years down the line, when our business will be X times, this is how our product might look. But in all probability, you will learn a lot more through that journey. So that picture is probably an overstatement of where you want to go. So my immediate reaction off the top of my head is to be a little bit more humble and get your MVP right for a very core defined set of use cases within a specific industry.
Right.
Once you
Right.
get that right, and once you crack it for one industry, it becomes relatively easier to then go talk to some of the other industries, bring their nuances, and play along. So that's from a B2B standpoint. So that's my only exposure, to building product in a purely startup setup was B2B. And that worked well for that company that I was part of, where they really spent the first couple of years figuring out how to make it work for a specific industry. This was a customer experience product, and it was in context of the hospitality industry. But over the next 10 years, they were able to successfully take that core MVP and then expand beyond hospitality because they had the core engine that was working really well for them.
Got it. No, that makes sense. So, like build the MVP, and the journey from 0 to 5 or 0 to 10 is always like hard. And your MVP is going to play a very important role if you are thinking about 100 different use cases. You are investing your energy, resources, and like literally all of them. So it is, instead of that, just focus on a couple of very strong like use cases slash candidates, and then try to like build product and then scale it from there. Yeah. Okay. So not going to like bug you with a lot of questions, Rohit. This is the last one, and this is from Madhuri. She says that in your literature there is a quadrant for solution space for building build to budget, and I want to understand what factors play an important role while deciding the cost. Could you share your experiences and insights?
All right. So I can share theory from a startup context because I don't have hands-on experience. I think if I'm building that product in a startup mode, my version of build to budget would be, if assuming if I've taken investment, and let's say if I have an 18-month runway to prove an outcome and go for another funding round. So then essentially that becomes my budget to make sure I can utilize it judiciously within that runway to be able to show the outcome so that then I can go knocking for the next round of funding. So that would be the definition of budget and a constraint for me in a startup setup. I think I've had more experience on the other side where in a consulting setup, a client may typically have a problem, then they come up to you to say, hey, is there something we can do in the digital space to be able to solve that problem? I think a lot of times when you calculate the budget bottoms up, assuming that you have figured out the right experience to solve that problem, you know what kind of engineering is going to need for that experience, including hardware and software, and you could make up a bottoms up budget. But in all probability, you might end up in a situation where that's not very amenable to the client, and they may have a top down number. So in more cases than not, that budget becomes an arbitrary piece of the pie in terms of the overall funding that the client may have based on the priority of the problem. It's something that's really impacting their top line. The budget tends to be more versus otherwise. Yeah, it's not, unfortunately, I don't have a very scientific answer. A lot of times you will get an arbitrary number to fit your experience in engineering. I think what I have found useful is to show early wins. If you can, even in the form of a no code or a design prototype, be able to say that, hey, this is the difference this experience is going to make to your business, either at the top line or saving some of the bottom line. I have found in more instances or not that budget becomes fungible. And then you're able to pound the table and ask for more based on those early wins. So again, going back to the whole philosophy over the last 20 years with Agile and, not having to wait 18 months to see a software working, I think I would say double down on your early wins, and that is one way to make your budget fungible.
Got it. So basically, work on your POCs and prove that, this is something that can work, and go find more budgets. So from a consulting practice perspective, Rohit, when we are talking about budgets and risk management becomes an important point to be discuss. So from a budgetary perspective, when stakeholders kind of approve budget, what delta do you based on your experience should the PMs keep? Should it be a 10% delta, a 15, less than 5? What does your point here?
In my experience, no matter what the number is, it's going to be at risk. So I think the way to look at it a little bit more objectively, which may or may not lead you to a quantified number, is how much risk you are willing to take on day one of the project. So if I have to, at the risk of generalization, the biggest driver for project to overrun budget is the lack of the team's readiness to be productive on day one. So as an example, a lot needs to happen before day one in terms of thinking through the product strategy, ensuring that this is a problem worth solving, gaining alignment between whoever signs the check and whoever is going to be the consumer of that experience. So all of these things need to fall in place in day one, including having the access to the right people and the right technology, the right infrastructure. And more often than not, most clients are not ready to engage on day one, which then leads to cascading delays. Either your designs are running late, which leads to your engineering overruns, which leads to compromises or half-baked decisions on architecture, which increases tech debt. So there is a cascading effect, which eventually shows up as a budget overrun. So what I would say, the short answer to your question is, based on the number of risks you are signing up for on day one, in terms of readiness to engage, the higher the number of risks, the higher should be your buffer for your budget, which would mean, anywhere between 30 to 40% on the higher side, versus, let's say, if you have full clarity on the strategy and why we're doing it, everybody's pounding on the table that this is the right thing to build, there is no stakeholder conflicts, everything from engineering to design is available and ready to start, you could tend to lower that number closer to single digits. It's a best case scenario that I've very rarely seen.
I would agree. Very hard to kind of get that delta into single digit. And now that we are talking about identifying risk, I think the selection of the project methodology also plays a very important role. So are you going with let's say waterfall, or are you going with agile? Plays an important role. So based on in your experience, Rohit, do you think that waterfall works best or agile works best? This is one of the hot questions.
I'm going to disappoint you again. I think I'll say horses for the courses. So there are definitely valid engineering efforts where you may have a degree of clarity in terms of what you want to build, and very little ambiguity. In that case, I think the ceremonial overhead of iterating every 2 weeks in an agile setup is not worth it. If it's a clear use case, if it's a small engineering team, and there is a degree of clarity which says, hey, this is the problem, this is the experience, and this is the approach for engineering, I would lean to waterfall. And I do that a lot for a lot of the internal projects that we do within the organization, where the risks out of waterfall are also internal. But what's happening more and more, and the reason why agile appears to be a panacea to everyone, is that degree of readiness is low, right? When you start a project, You may have the budget, you may have the schedule as to when you want to launch, but the why and the how may not always be clear. And the reason that sometimes we tend to defer to agile is because it gives you an appearance that you can delay some of the decisions. Which in hindsight is not really accurate. In fact, it's exactly opposite. If you want to be productive every 2 weeks and ship an outcome that's valuable, you need to spend more time in planning. So I would tend towards agile if there is a lot of ambiguity in terms of what experience we need to build. And then I will say I'll lean more towards iterative methods than saying agile, because there are a lot more ways to be iterative in addition to be than just being agile.
Yeah, and at every 2 weeks, often we see within our groups, it's like, oh hey, something is not achieved. All right, let's add it to the backlog. So we sometimes not running in sprints, even though we call that a sprint. And
Right.
the benefit I see with agile is that the visibility of where do you stand. And as you mentioned, sometimes you may not have the answers to how you're doing, why you're doing, and maybe having a lot of unknowns in that entire process. On the other side, waterfalls helps you to understand, get more clarity on what are those unknowns, how are you going to do it, what resources you may be required, and just set the expectations before, versus agile, that lets you change over the period of time. So I think the change here is a key factor. If you're pretty sure about what you're building, waterfall makes sense. If your changes are dependent on the markets, the changing conditions, I think agile works. No, thanks for that insights, Rohit. Great. So I'll open up the mic for everyone. Amit, Narendran, Madhuri, Pratik, Nandi, if you have any questions, feel free to ask Rohit.
Hi Rohit, Pratik this side.
Hey Pratik.
Thank you so much for sharing the valuable journey till now. It's been a pleasure listening to you. I think this 1.5 hours long session will surely help all of us at FP product team to gain something new from tomorrow onwards. So, and as we reach to the conclusion, I think I would like to listen a poem from you. You're a big fan of writing poems, so I would not I'll not ask anything from the product side. I would love to hear a poem from you.
All right, this was a question that I hadn't prepared for. All right.
Anyone which is coming to your mind. I think
I definitely don't know everything I've written by
no
heart.
worries, no
So
worries.
I'm just opening up the browser as we're speaking to figure out, something that's more timely through, what we're going on. Give me 10, 15 seconds. And so yeah, I think in context, so let me try to make a connection to product.
Yes, that would be really awesome.
This is a poem I wrote in context of a lot of dialogue that happens in our social and physical lives around holding a certain beliefs so close to your heart that it starts to harm others. And something like that will also happen if product managers tend to be dogmatic within their teams. So the title of this poem is Don't, and this is how it goes. Don't believe every thought. Don't act on every emotion. Don't opine in every debate. Don't react to every instigation. Don't chase every desire. Don't succumb to every fear. Don't rave every win. Don't agonize every loss. Don't earn for every memory. Don't fantasize every dream. You may think you are the doer in every act. You may sense the world as another separate fact. Don't.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rohit.
Wow, beautiful.
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Pratik.
No, and sometimes it's important to slow down and not run behind. So I think I really like that, like, sentence from your poem, that don't run behind every thought. It is not necessary. Focus on what you have, and be kind to yourself. It's a marathon and not a sprint. Even though we work in sprints in Agile, it's a marathon. It's a long, like, run that we have to go through.
Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, thanks for all the questions, Nav. I think it forced me to think through and backtrack a lot of decisions I've taken. So yeah, thanks for keeping me honest.
No, thank you, Rohit, for your time this evening. It was amazing, having this interaction with you, learning more about blockchain, DAOs, and community. Community is going to play a very important role, and like building culture for leaders who listening this. It's important, like, you be the example. You take the first step and own that culture. If you're not owning, it's no matter, like, whether you're having a beautiful office and, like, maybe work from home policy and so on, but if you're not adhering to what you're saying, maybe your team may not follow you, and that's going to hurt you in the long run. So once again, thank you so much, Rohit, for your time, and we will definitely, like, set up another, like, call just only for culture. There's so much to learn from you. So yeah, I will look forward to the next call sometime soon.
Thanks, Nav. Thanks, Aaron, for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care, and have a good rest of your evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.